Alrighty, sorry about the late start. Welcome back to another thrilling installment of Wordy Wednesdays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fragath, and today we're going to be reading more of Permutation City by Gregg Egan. Actually, the last installment of Permutation City, I should say. And here we have a cover that lies like a rug. I'm moderately confident that they did not at any time say that there were, in fact, 10 million people living there. Let's just really quick rewind and see if it's mentioned. Do, 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 do. Split up results immediately, blah, 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 blah. So yeah, this is going to be the final installment. So what had happened last time is it turns out that Paul Durham's dust theory and plan to make a TVC universe in which he would basically be anyone there would effectively be immortal was dead right. So he and the founders were all their copies, that is, are all there and have been there for about 7,000 years so far, subjective years. And he decides to wake Maria Deluca. She's not happy about this, but he has a good reason for it. It turns out that Planet Lambert, that project she worked on all that time ago for him, is, well, it's born life. Not only is it born life, it is born sentient life. Now, because it's on the TVC autoverse, um, the autoverse chunk of the TVC, it's been a couple billion years because they have the computing capacity to just run it at top speed. Let's see. I'm still trying to find how many people are there because basically people have digitally intermarried and given birth to multiple generations of people, but I'm quite confident it's not 10 million. I might be wrong. I'm pretty confident. So I don't know why this cover decided to do that. Who knows? 7,000 years, all the libraries. Man, if only I could control F with a book, right? I'm skimming it right now, and I might have missed it already. No, 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 no. Unless it's right on the first page, that'd be embarrassing. No. Puppet citizens. Those aren't real people. Launch worked. This is embarrassing. No, he goes right to showing her Planet Lambert stuff. Maybe it's in the next chapter. Anyway, I don't need to be proving that it's not populated by 10 million actual people. I need to get to reading it. So yeah, this will be the last installment. It's not going to be terribly long. Well, actually, it's like 50 pages. And then he's got an FAQ, frequently asked, the dust theory, frequently asked questions on greggegan.net slash permutation slash FAQ slash FAQ.html. Which I have linked in the stream description, and I will read from. That'll be short. It's maybe a page and a half, 2 pages at most. Anyway, that will contain massive spoilers for a book that we will have just read through. So he warns us, and I warn you. So I've had an interesting dialogue with someone over YouTube comments about what's going on with Thomas Riemann, and we will actually have a bit more Thomas Riemann um, this go round. Uh, One of the things I like about Greg Egan is certain things are either are they're not so much left ambiguous as they're left somewhat open-ended in books like these. His other ones, not so much. He's usually pretty detail-oriented, to be honest. But in that, he just doesn't include details that aren't relevant to what he's trying to show. Uh, this winds up having a pretty hefty cast, and a lot of his others don't. Um, Exceptions abound, namely the Clockwork Rocket trilogy, or Arrow of Time trilogy, whatever it's called. Um, that one has a fairly large cast, but it kind of rotates through three books, though. So, anyway, without further ado, let's get crack-a-lackin' and read through more. I just lost the page. That's why I'm pausing. There it is. Okay. And read through the rest of Permutation City by Gregg Egan. Chapter 27, Rut City. Pier felt the change begin, and switched off the lathe. He looked around the workshop helplessly, his eyes alighting on object after object which he couldn't imagine living without. The belt sander, the rack full of cutting tools for the lathe, cans of oil, tins of varnish. The pile of freshly cut timber itself. Abandoning these things, or worse, abandoning his love for them, his love of them, seemed like the definition of extinction. Then he began to perceive the situation differently. He felt himself step back from his life as a carpenter into the larger scheme of things, or non-scheme, the random stutterings from pretext to pretext which granted his existence its various meanings. His sense of loss became impossible to sustain. His enthusiasm for everything to which he'd been devoted for the past 76 years evaporated like a dream. He was not repelled or bewildered by the phase he was leaving behind, but he had no desire to extend or repeat it. His tools, his clothes, the workshop itself, all melted away, leaving behind a featureless gray plain, stretching to infinity beneath a dazzling blue sky, sunless but radiant. He waited calmly to discover his new vocation, remembering the last transition and thinking, these brief moments between are a laugh in themselves. He imagined picking up the same train of thought and advancing it, slightly, the next time. Then the empty ground grew a vast room around him, stretching in all directions for hundreds of meters, full of row after row of yellow wooden specimen drawers. A high ceiling with dusty skylights came together above him, completing the scene. He blinked in the gloom. He was wearing heavy black trousers and a waistcoat over a stiff white shirt. His exo-self, having chosen an obsession which would have been meaningless in a world of advanced computers, had dressed him for the part of a Victorian naturalist. The drawers, he knew, were full of beetles. Hundreds of thousands of beetles. He was free, now, to do nothing with his time but study them, sketch them, annotate them, classify them, specimen by specimen, species by species, decade after decade. The prospect was so blissful that he almost keeled over with joy. As he approached the nearest set of drawers, where a blank legal pad and a pencil were already waiting for him, he hesitated and tried to make sense of his feelings. He knew why he was happy here. His exoself had rewired his brain, yet again, as he'd programmed it to do. What more sense did he require? He looked around the musty room, trying to pin down the source of his dissatisfaction. Everything was perfect, here and now, but his past was still with him. The gray plane of transition, his decades at the lathe, the times he'd spent with Kate, his previous obsessions. The time he'd spent with Kate, his previous obsessions. The long-dead David Hawthorne, invincible, clinging to a rock face. None of it bore the slightest connection to his present interests, his present surroundings, but the details still hovered at the edge of his thoughts, superfluous, anachronistic distractions. He was dressed for a role, so why not complete the illusion? He'd tinkered with false memories before. Why not construct a virtual past which explained his situation and his enthusiasm for the task ahead in terms which befitted the environment? Why not create a person with no memory of Peer, who could truly lose himself in the delights of being unleashed on this priceless collection? He opened a window to his exoself, and together they began to invent the biography of an entomologist. Peer stared blankly at the flickering electric lamp in the corner of the room, then marched over to it and read the scrawled note on the table beneath. Talk to me. Something is wrong. He hesitated, then created a door beside the lamp. Kate stepped through. Excuse me. She was ashen. She said, I spend half my life trying to reach you. When is it going to stop? Oh, I spend half my life trying to reach you. When is it going to stop? Her tone was flat, as if she wanted to be angry but didn't have the strength. Peer raised a hand to her cheek. She pushed it away. He said, What's the problem? The problem? You've been missing for 4 weeks. 4 weeks? Peer almost laughed, but she looked so shaken that he stopped himself. He said, You know I get caught up in what I'm doing. It's important to me. But I'm sorry if you were worried. She brushed his words aside. You were missing. I didn't say you didn't answer my call. The environment we're standing in, and its owner, did not exist. Why do you think that? The communication software announced that there was no process accepting data addressed to your personal node. The system lost you. Peer was surprised. He hadn't trusted Malcolm Carter to start with, but after all this time it seemed unlikely that there were major problems with the infrastructure he'd woven into the city for them. He said, Lost track of me, maybe. Lost track of me, maybe. For how long? 29 days. Has this ever happened before? Kate laughed bitterly. No! What? Do you think I would have kept it to myself? I have never come across a basic software failure of any kind until now. And there are automatic logs which confirm that. This is the first time. Peer scratched his neck beneath the starched collar. The interruption had left him disoriented. He couldn't remember what he'd been doing when the flashing lamp had caught his attention. His memory needed maintenance. He said, It's worrying, but I don't see what we can do except run some diagnostics, try to pinpoint the problem. I ran diagnostics while the problem was happening. And? There was certainly nothing wrong with the communication software, but none of the systems involved with running you were visible to the diagnostics. That's impossible. Did you suspend yourself? Of course not. And that wouldn't explain anything. Even if I had, the systems responsible for me would still have been active. So what have you been doing? Peer looked around the room, back to where he'd been standing. There was a specimen drawer on one of the desks and a thick legal pad beside it. He walked up to the desk. Kate followed. He said, "Drawing beetles, apparently." Perhaps 100 pages of the pad had been used and flipped over. An unfinished sketch of one of the specimens was showing. Pierre was certain that he'd never seen it before. Kate picked up the pad and stared at the drawing, then flipped back through the previous pages. She said, "Why the pseudonym? Aren't the clothes affectation enough?" "What pseudonym?" She held the pad in front of him and pointed to his signature. "Sir William Baxter, F.R.S." Pierre steadied himself against the desk and struggled to fill the gap. He'd been playing some kind of memory game, that much was obvious, but surely he would have set things up so he'd understand what had happened, in the end. When Kate made contact, breaking the spell, his exoself should have granted him a full explanation. He mentally invoked its records. The last event shown was his most recent random transition. Whatever he'd done since, there was no trace of it. He said dully, "The name means nothing to me." Stranger still, the thought of spending 29 days sketching beetles left him cold. Any passion he'd felt for insect taxonomy had vanished along with his memories, as if the whole package had belonged to someone else entirely, who'd now claimed it and departed. Chapter 28. As the city slowly imprinted itself upon her brain, every dazzling sunset leaving its golden afterimage burning on her non-existent retinas, every journey she made wiring maps of the non-existent streets into her non-existent synapses, Maria felt herself drifting apart from her memories of the old world. The details were sharp as ever, but her history was losing its potency, its meaning. Having banished the idea of grieving for people who had not died, and who had not lost her, all she seemed to have left to feel was nostalgia, and even that was undermined by contradictions. She missed rooms, streets, smells. Sometimes it was so painful it was comical. She lay awake thinking about the shabbiest abandoned buildings of Piermont, or the cardboard stench of ersatz popcorn wafting out of the VR parlors on George Street. And she knew that she could reconstruct her old house, all of its surroundings, all of Sydney, and more, in as much detail as she wished. She knew that every last idiot ache she felt for the amputated past could be dealt with in an instant. Understanding exactly how far she could go was more than enough to rid her of any desire to take a single step in that direction. But having chosen to make no effort to relieve the pangs of homesickness, she seemed to have forfeited her right to the emotion. I'm going to reread that because I mangled that. But having chosen to make no effort to relieve the pangs of homesickness, she seemed to have forfeited her right to the emotion. How could she claim to long for something which she could so easily possess, while continuing to deny it to herself? So she tried to set the past aside. She studied the Lambertians diligently, preparing for the day when contact would be permitted. She tried to immerse herself in the role of the legendary 18th founder, roused from her millennia of sleep to share the triumphant moment when the people of Elysium would finally come face to face with an alien creature. Lambertian communities, despite some similarities to those of terrestrial social insects, were far more complex and much less hierarchical than the nests of ants or hives of bees. For a start, all Lambertians were equally fertile. There was no queen, no workers, no drones. The young were conceived in plants at the periphery of the local territory, and upon hatching, usually migrated hundreds of kilometers to become members of distant communities. There they joined teams and learned their specialty, be it herding, defense against predators, or modeling the formation of planetary systems. Specialization was usually for life, but team members occasionally changed professions if the need arose. Lambertian group behavior had a long evolutionary history, and it remained the driving force in cultural development. Because individual Lambertians were physically incapable of inventing, testing, or communicating the models by which the most sophisticated ideas were expressed. An individual could learn enough about a model while taking part in a successful dance to enable it to exchange roles with any other individual the next time the dance was performed, but it could never ponder the implications of the idea itself in solitude. The language of the dance was like human writing, formal logic, mathematical notation, and computing all rolled into one, but the basic skills were innate, not cultural. And it was so successful and so much in tune with other aspects of their social behavior that the Lambertians had never had reason to develop a self-contained alternative. Individuals were far from unthinking components, though. They were fully conscious in their own right. Groups performed many roles, but they did not comprise communal minds. The language of sounds, movements, and scents used by individuals was far simpler than the group language of the dance, but it could still express most of the concepts which pre-literate humans had dealt with: intentions, past experience, the lives of others. And individual Lambertians spoke of individual death. They knew that they would die. Maria searched the literature for some clue to the way they dealt with their mortality. Corpses were left where they dropped. There was no ritual to mark the event, and no evidence of anything like grief. There were no clear Lambertian analogues for any of the human emotions, not even physical pain. When injured, they were acutely aware of the fact and took steps to minimize damage to themselves, but it was a matter of specific instinctive responses coming into play, rather than the widespread biochemical shifts involved in human mood changes. The Lambertian nervous system was tighter than a human's. There was no flooding of regions of the brain with large doses of endogenous stimulants or depressants. Everything was mediated within the enclosed synapses. No grief, no pain, no happiness? Maria retreated from the question. The Lambertians possessed their own spectrum of thoughts and behavior. Any attempt to render it in human terms would be as false as the colors of the autoverse atoms themselves. The more she learned, the more the role she'd played in bringing the Lambertians into existence seemed to recede into insignificance. Fine-tuning their single-celled ancestor had seemed like a matter of the utmost importance at the time, if only for the sake of persuading the skeptics that autoverse life could flourish. Now, although a few of her biochemical tricks had been conserved over 3 billion years of evolution, it was hard to attribute any real significance to the choices she'd made. Even though the whole Lambertian biosphere might have been transformed beyond recognition if she'd selected a different shape for a single enzyme in A. hydrophila, she couldn't think of the Lambertians as being dependent on her actions. The decisions she'd made controlled what she was witnessing on her terminal, nothing more. She had made other choices. Had she made other choices, she would have seen another biosphere, another civilization. But she could not believe that the Lambertians themselves would have failed to have lived the very same lives without her. Somehow, they still would have found a way to assemble themselves from the dust. If that was true, though, if the internal logic of their experience would have been enough to bring them into existence, then there was no reason to believe that they would ever be forced to conclude that their universe required a creator. She tried to reconcile this growing conviction with the contact group's optimism. They'd studied the Lambertians for thousands of years. Who was she to doubt their expertise? Then it occurred to her that Durham and his colleagues might have decided to feign satisfaction with the political restrictions imposed upon them until they knew where she stood on the issue. Until she reached the same conclusions independently? Durham might have guessed that she'd resist being pressured into taking their side. It would be far more diplomatic to leave her to form her own opinions, even applying a little reverse psychology to aim her in the right direction. Or was that sheer paranoia? After 5 days of studying the Lambertians, tracing the history of their increasingly successful attempts to explain their world, and 5 nights trying to convince herself that they'd soon give it all up and recognize their status as artificial life, she could no longer hold the contradictions in her head. She phoned Durham. It was 3 in the morning, but he must have been out of the city. Standard Time set a rate, but no diurnal cycle, and behind him was a dazzling sunlit room. She said bluntly, "I think I'd like to hear the truth now. Why did you wake me?" He seemed unsurprised by the question, but he replied guardedly, "Why do you think?" "You want my support for an early expedition to Planet Lambert. You want me to declare, with all the dubious authority of the mother of the Lambertians, that there's no point waiting for them to invent the idea of us. Because we both know it's never going to happen. Not until they've seen us with their own eyes." Durham said, "You're right about the Lambertians, but forget the politics. I woke you because your territory adjoins the region where the autoverse is run. I want you to let me use it to break through to Planet Lambert." He looked like a child solemnly confessing some childish crime. "Access through the hub is strictly controlled, and visible to everyone. There's plenty of unused space in the sixth public wedge, so I could try to get in from there. But, again, it's potentially visible. Your territory is private." Maria felt a surge of anger. She could scarcely believe that she'd ever swallowed the line about being woken to share in the glory of contact. And being used by Durham was no great shock. It was just like old times. But having been resurrected, not for her expertise, not for her status, but so he could dig a tunnel through her backyard, she said bitterly, "Why do you need to break into the autoverse? Is there a race going on that nobody's bothered to tell me about? Bored fucking immortals battling it out to make their first unauthorized contact with the Lambertians? Have you turned xenobiology into a new Olympian sport? It's nothing like that." "No? What then? I'm dying to know." Maria tried to read his face for what it was worth. He allowed himself to appear ashamed, but he also looked grimly determined, as if he really did believe that he'd had no choice. It hit her suddenly. "You think there's some kind of risk to Elysium from the autoverse?" "Yes." "I see. So you woke me in time to share the danger? How thoughtful." "Maria, I'm sorry. If there'd been another way, I would have let you sleep forever." She started laughing and shivering at the same time. Durham placed one palm flat against the screen. She was still angry with him, but she let him reach through the terminal from his day-lit room and put his hand on hers. She said, "Why do you have to act in secret? Can't you persuade the others to agree to stop running the autoverse? They must realize that it wouldn't harm the Lambertians. It would launch them as surely as it launched Elysium. There's no question of genocide. All right, it would be a loss to the autoverse scholars, but how many of those can there be? What does Planet Lambert mean to the average Elysian? It's just one more kind of entertainment." "I've already tried to shut it down. I'm authorized to set the running speed relative to standard time, and to freeze the whole autoverse, temporarily, if I see the need to stem the informational flow, to let us catch up with rapid developments." "So what happened? They made you restart it?" "No, I never managed to freeze it. It can't be done anymore. The clock rate can't be slowed past a certain point. The software ignores the instructions. Nothing happens." Maria felt a deep chill spread out from the base of her spine. "He ignores them how? That's impossible." "It would be impossible if everything was working. So, obviously, some things failed. The question is, at what level? I can't believe that the control software is suddenly revealing a hidden bug after all this time. If it's not responding the way it should, then the processes running it aren't behaving correctly. So either they've been damaged somehow, or the cellular automaton itself has changed. I think the TVC rules are being undermined, or subsumed into something larger." "Do you have any hard evidence?"
No, I've rerun the old validation experiments, the ones I ran during the launch, and they still work, wherever I've tried them. But I can't even instruct the processes running the autoverse to diagnose themselves, let alone probe what's happening there at the lowest level. I don't even know if the problem is confined to the region, or if it's spreading out slowly, or if it's already happening everywhere, but the effects are too subtle to pick up. You know, the only way to validate the rules is with special apparatus. So, what do I do? Disassemble half the processes in Elysium and build test chambers in their place? And even if I could prove that the rules were being broken, how would that help? Who else knows about this? Only Repetto and Zemansky. If it became public knowledge, I don't know what would happen. Maria was outraged. What gives you the right to keep this to yourselves? Some people might panic, but what are you afraid of? Riots? Looting? The more people who know about the problem, the more likely it is that someone will come up with a solution. Perhaps. Or perhaps the mere fact that more people know would make things worse. Maria absorbed that in silence. The sunlight spilling through the terminal cast radial shadows around her. The room looked like a medieval woodcut of an alchemist discovering the philosopher's stone. Durham said, "Do you know why I chose the autoverse in the first place, instead of real-world physics? Less computation, easier to seed with life, my brilliant work with A. Lamberti. No nuclear processes. No explanation for the origins of the elements. I thought, in the unlikely event that the planet yielded intelligent life, they'd still only be able to make sense of themselves on our terms. It all seemed so remote and improbable then. It never occurred to me that they might miss the laws that we know are laws and circumvent the whole problem. They haven't settled on any kind of theory yet. They might still come up with a cellular automaton model, complete with the need for a creator. They might, but what if they don't?" Maria's throat was dry. The numbing abstractions were losing their hypnotic power. She was beginning to feel all too real, too corporeal, too vulnerable. Good timing. Finally embracing the illusion of possessing the solid flesh and blood, just as the foundations of this universe seemed ready to turn to quicksand. She said, "You tell me. I'm tired of guessing what's going on in your head. We can't shut them down. I think that proves that they are already affecting Elysium. If they successfully explain their origins in a way which contradicts the autoverse rules, then that may distort the TVC rules. Perhaps only in the region where the autoverse is run, or perhaps everywhere. And if the TVC rules are pulled out from under us—" Maria balked. "That's like claiming that a VR environment could alter the real world laws of physics in order to guarantee its own internal consistency. Even with thousands of copies in VR environments, that never happened back on Earth." "No, but which is most like the real world, Elysium or the autoverse?" Durham laughed without bitterness. "We're all still patchwork copies, most of us in private fantasy lands. Our bodies are ad hoc approximations. Our cities are indestructible wallpaper. The laws of physics of all the environments in Elysium contradict each other, and themselves, a billion times a day. Ultimately, yes, everything runs on the TVC processes, it's all consistent with the TVC rules, but level after level is sealed off, made invisible to the next, made irrelevant. On Planet Lambert, everything that happens is intimately tied to one set of physical laws, applied uniformly everywhere. And they've had 3 billion years of that. We may not know what the deepest laws are anymore, but every event the Lambertians experience is part of a coherent whole. If there's any conflict between the two versions of reality, we can't rely on our own version taking precedence." Maria couldn't argue for patchwork VR holding up against the deep logic of the autoverse. She said, "Then surely the safest thing would be to ensure that there is no conflict. Stop observing the autoverse. Give up all plans of making contact. Isolate the two explanations. Keep them from clashing." Durham said flatly, "No, we're already in conflict. Why else can't we shut them down?" "I don't know." Maria looked away. "If the worst comes to the worst, can't we start again? Construct a new Garden of Eden configuration? Launch ourselves again without the autoverse?
If we have to,
He added, if we think we can trust the TVC universe to do everything it's programmed to do, without altering the launch process, fouling it up, or even passing on the modified laws which we think we're escaping. Maria looked out at the city. Buildings were not collapsing. The illusion was not decaying. She said, if we can't trust in that, what's left? Durham said grimly, nothing. If we don't know how this universe works anymore, we're powerless. She pulled her hand free. So what do you want to do? Do you think if you have access to more of the autoverse than the data channels running out from the hub, you can make the TVC rules apply? Or one whole face of the pyramid shouting "Stop!" to the neighboring processors will carry more weight than the normal chain of command? No, that might be worth trying, but I don't believe it will work. Then what? Durham leaned forward urgently. We have to win back the laws. We have to go into the autoverse and convince the Lambertians to accept our explanation of their history before they have a clear alternative. We have to persuade them that we created them before that's no longer the truth. Chapter 29. Thomas sat in the garden, watching the robots tend the flower beds. Their silver limbs glinted in the sunshine as they reached between the dazzling white blossoms. Every movement they made was precise, economical. There was no faltering, no resting. They did what they had to, and moved on. When they were gone, he sat and waited. The grass was soft, the sky was bright, the air was calm. He wasn't fooled. There'd been moments like this before, moments approaching tranquility. They meant nothing, heralded nothing, changed nothing. There'd always be another version of decay, another nightmare of mutilation, and another return to Hamburg. Hamburg. He scratched the smooth skin of his abdomen. The last number he'd cut had healed long ago. Since then, he'd stabbed his body in 1,000 places, slit his wrists and throat, punctured his lungs, sliced open the femoral artery. Or so he believed. No evidence of the injuries remained. The stillness of the garden began to unnerve him. There was a blankness to the scene he couldn't penetrate, as if he was staring at an incomprehensible diagram, or an abstract painting he couldn't quite parse. As he gazed across the lawn, the colors and textures flooding in on him suddenly dissociated completely into meaningless patches of light. Nothing had moved, nothing had changed, but his power to interpret the arrangement of shades and hues had vanished. The garden had ceased to exist. Panicking, Thomas reached blindly for the scar on his forearm. When his fingers made contact, the effect was immediate. The world around him came together again. He sat, rigid for a moment, waiting to see what would happen next, but the stretch of dark green in the corner of his eye remained a shadow cast by a fountain. The blue expanse above remained the sky. He curled up on the grass, stroking the dead skin, crooning to himself. He believed he'd once hacked the scar right off. The new wound he'd made had healed without a trace, but the original faint white line had reappeared in its proper place. It was the sole mark of his identity now. His face, when he sought it in the mirrors inside the house, was unrecognizable. His name was a meaningless jumble of sounds. But whenever he began to lose his sense of himself, he only had to touch the scar to recall everything which defined him. He closed his eyes. He danced around the flat with Anna. She stank of alcohol, sweat, and perfume. He was ready to ask her to marry him. He could feel the moment approaching, and he was almost suffocating with fear and hope. He said, God, you're beautiful. Order my life. I'm nothing without you. Fragments of time, fragments of words, fragments of feelings. Make sense of me. Make me whole. That's thoughts. Internal monologue. Anna said, I'm going to ask you for something I've never asked for before. I've been trying to work up the courage all day. You can ask for anything. Let me understand you. Let me piece you together, hold you together. Let me help you to explain yourself. She said, I have a friend with a lot of cash, almost 200,000 marks. He needs someone who can. Thomas stepped back from her, then struck her hard across the face. He felt betrayed, wounded, and ridiculous. She started punching him in the chest and face. He stood there and let her do it, for a while, then grabbed both her hands by the wrists. She caught her breath. Let go of me. I'm sorry. Then let go of me. He didn't. He said, I'm not a money laundering facility for your friends. She looked at him pityingly. Oh, what have I done? Offended your high moral principles? All I did was ask. You might have made yourself useful. Never mind. I should have known it was too much to expect. He pushed his face close to hers. Where are you going to be in 10 years' time? In prison? At the bottom of the Elbe? Fuck off. Where? Tell me. She said, I can think of worse fates. I could end up playing happy families with a middle-aged banker. Thomas threw her toward the wall. Her feet slipped from under her before she hit it. Her head struck the bricks as she was going down. He crouched beside her, disbelieving. There was a wide gash in the back of her head. She was breathing. He patted her cheeks, then tried to open her eyes. They'd rolled up into her skull. She'd ended up almost sitting on the floor, legs sprawled in front of her, head lolling against the wall. Blood pooled around her. He said, Think fast. Think fast. Time slowed. Every detail in the room clamored for attention. The light from the one dull bulb in the ceiling was almost blinding. Every edge of every shadow was razor sharp. Thomas shifted on the lawn, felt the grass brush against him. It would take so little strength, so little courage, so little love. It was not beyond imagining. Anna's face burned in his eyes, sweet and terrible. He had never been so afraid. He knew that if he failed to kill her, he was nothing. No other part of him remained. Only her death made sense of what he'd become, the shame and madness which were all he had left. To believe that he had saved her would be to forget himself forever. To die. He forced himself to lie still on the grass. Waves of numbness swept through his body. Shaking, he phoned for an ambulance. His voice surprised him. He sounded calm, in control. Then he knelt beside Anna and slid one hand behind her head. Warm blood trickled down his arm, under the sleeve of his shirt. If she lived, he might not go to prison, but the scandal would still destroy him. He cursed himself and put his ear to her mouth. She hadn't stopped breathing. His father would disinherit him. He stared blankly into the future and stroked Anna's cheek. He heard the paramedics on the stairs. The door was locked. He had to get up to let them in. He stood back helplessly as they examined her, then lifted her onto the stretcher. He followed them out through the front door. One of the men locked eyes with him coldly as they maneuvered the stretcher around the landing. Pay extra to smack them around, do you? Thomas shook his head innocently. It's not what it looks like. Reluctantly, they let him ride in the back. Thomas heard the driver radio the police. He held Anna's hand and gazed down at her. Her fingers were icy. Her face was white. The ambulance took a corner. He reached out with his free hand to steady himself. Without looking up, he asked, Will she be all right? Nobody'll know that until she's been x-rayed. It was an accident. We were dancing. She slipped. Whatever you say. They sped through the streets, weaving through a universe of neon and headlights rendered silent by the wail of the siren. Thomas kept his eyes on Anna. He held her hand tightly, and with all of his being willed her to live, but he resisted the urge to pray. Chapter 30. The leaders of the contact group assembled in Maria's apartment. They'd barely taken their seats when Durham said, "I think we should move to my territory before we proceed any further. I'm on the far side of the hub from the autoverse region, for what that's worth. If distance still means anything, we should at least try to run our models somewhere reliable." Maria felt sick. The city itself was right beside the autoverse, the fairground on the edge of the desert. But no Elysians were being computed in that public space, only buildings and puppet pedestrians. She said, "Six other founders have pyramids adjoining the autoverse. If you think there's a chance that effects are spilling over the border, can't you find a pretext to get them to move their people as far away as possible? You don't have to spell things out. You don't have to tell them anything that might increase the danger." Durham said wearily, "I've had enough trouble persuading 37 dedicated autoverse scholars to occupy themselves with projects which will keep them out of our way. If I started suggesting to Elaine Sanderson, Angelo Repetto, and Tetsuo Tsukamoto that they rearrange the geometry of their computing resources, it would take them about 10 seconds to put the entire autoverse under scrutiny to try to find out what's going on. And the other 3 pyramids are occupied by hermits who haven't shown themselves since the launch. We couldn't warn them even if we wanted to. The best thing we can do is deal with the problem as quickly and inconspicuously as possible." Maria glanced at Dominic Repetto, but apparently he was resigned to the need to keep his family in the dark. She said, "It makes me feel like a coward, fleeing to the opposite side of the universe while we poke the hornets' nests by remote control." Repetto said dryly, "Don't worry. For all we know, the TVC geometry might be irrelevant. The logical connection between us and the autoverse might put us at more risk than the closest physical neighbors." Maria still chose to do everything manually, via her solid terminal. No interface windows floating in midair, no telepathic links to her exoself. Zemansky showed her how to run the obscure utility program which would transport her right out of her own territory. The less wealthy copies back on Earth had darted from continent to continent in search of the cheapest quips, but in Elysium there would never have been a reason for anyone to shift this way before. As she okayed the last query on the terminal, she pictured her model being halted, taken apart, and piped through the hub into Durham's pyramid, no doubt with a billion careful verification steps along the way. But it was impossible to know what even the most stringent error-checking procedures were worth, now that the deepest rules upon which they relied had been called into question. As a final touch, Durham cloned the apartment, and they moved, imperceptibly, to the duplicated version. Maria glanced out the window. "Did you copy the old city as well?" "No, that's the original you're looking at. I've patched in a genuine view." Zemansky created a series of interface windows on the living room wall. One showed the region running the autoverse, with the triangular face which bordered Maria's own pyramid seen head-on. On top of the software map, the midnight blue of the Autoverse cellular automaton program, finely veined with silver spy software, she overlaid a schematic of the Lambertian planetary system, the orbits weirdly chopped up and rearranged to fit into the 5 adjacent pyramids. The space being modeled was, on its own terms, a relatively thin disk, only a few 100,000 kilometers thick, but stretching about 50% beyond the orbit of the outermost planet. Most of it was empty, or filled with nothing but light streaming out from the sun, but there were no shortcuts taken. Every cubic kilometer, however featureless, was being modeled straight down to the level of autoverse cells. The profligacy of it was breathtaking. Maria could barely look at the map without trying to think of techniques to approximate the computations going on in all that near vacuum. When she forced herself to stop and accept the thing as it was, she realized that she'd never fully grasped the scale of Elysium before. She'd toured the Lambertian biosphere from the planetary level right down to the molecular, but that was nothing compared to a solar system's worth of subatomic calculations. Durham touched her elbow. "I'm going to need your authorization." She went with him to the terminal he'd created for himself in a corner of the room, and typed out the code number which had been embedded in her scan file back on Earth. The 99 digits flowed from her fingers effortlessly, as if she'd rehearsed the sequence 1,000 times. The code which would have granted her access to her deceased estate on Earth here unlocked the processors of her pyramid. She said, "I really am your accomplice now. Who goes to prison when you commit a crime using my ID? We don't have prisons. So what exactly will the other Elysians do to us when they find out what we've done?" "Express appropriate gratitude." Zemansky zoomed in on the map to show the individual TVC processors along the border, then enlarged the view still further to reveal their elaborate structure. It looked like a false color schematic of an array of three-dimensional microcircuits. But it was too rectilinear, too perfect to be a micrograph of any real object. The map was largely conjecture now, a simulation guided by limited data flowing in from the grid itself. There were good reasons why it should have been correct, but there could be no watertight evidence that anything they were seeing was actually there. Zemansky manipulated the view until they were peering straight down the middle of the thin layer of transparent null cells which separated the autoverse region from Maria's territory, bringing her own processors into sight for the first time. An arrow in a small key diagram above showed the orientation. They were looking straight toward the distant hub. All the processors were structurally identical, but those in the autoverse were alive with the coded streams of activated states marking data. Jeez, let's try this again. All the processors were structurally identical, but those in the autoverse were alive with the coded streams of activated states marking data flows, while her own were almost idle. Then Durham plugged her territory into the software he was running, and a wave of data swept out from the hub, looking like something from the Stargate sequence in 2001, as the processors were reprogrammed. 2001: A Space Odyssey. The real wave would have passed in a standard time picosecond. The map was smart enough to show the event in slow motion. The reprogrammed processors flickered with data, and then began to sprout construction wires. Every processor in the TVC grid was a von Neumann machine as well as a Turing machine, a universal constructor as well as a universal computer. The only construction task they'd performed in the past had been a one-off act of self-replication, but they still retained the potential to build anything at all, given the appropriate blueprint. The construction wires reached across the gap and touched the surface of the autoverse processors. Maria held her breath, almost expecting to see a defensive reaction, a counterattack. Durham had analyzed the possibilities in advance. If the TVC rules continued to hold true, any war between these machines would soon reach a perpetual stalemate. They could face each other forever, annihilating each other's weapons as fast as they grew, and no strategy could ever break the deadlock. If the TVC rules failed, though, there was no way of predicting the outcome. There was no detectable counterattack. The construction wires withdrew, leaving behind data links bridging the gap between the pyramids. Since the map was showing the links as intact, the software must have received some evidence that they were actually working. The autoverse processors were at least reacting as they should to simple tests of the integrity of the connections. Durham said, "Well, that's something. They haven't managed to shut us out completely." Repetto grimaced. "You make it sound like the Lambertians have taken control of the processors, that they're deciding what's going on here. They don't even know this level exists." Durham kept his eyes on the screen. "Of course they don't, but it still feels like we're sneaking up on some kind of sentient adversary. Sentient adversary. The Lambertians' guardian angels, aware of all the levels, but jealously defending their own people's version of reality." He caught Maria's worried glance and smiled. "Only joking." Maria looked on as Durham and Zemansky ran a Zemansky. Maria looked on as Durham and Zemansky ran a series of tests to verify that they really had plugged in to the autoverse region. Sorry. Everything checked out. But then, all the same tests had worked when run through the authorized link down at the hub. The suspect processors were merely acting as messengers, passing data around in a giant loop which confirmed that they could still talk to each other, that the basic structure of the grid hadn't fallen apart. Durham said, "Now we try to stop the clock." He hit a few keys, and Maria watched his commands racing across the links. She thought, maybe there was something wrong down at the hub. Maybe this whole crisis is going to turn out to be nothing but a tiny, localized bug. Perfectly explicable, easily fixed. Durham said, "No luck. I'll try to reduce the rate." Again, the commands were ignored. Next, he increased the autoverse clock rate by 50%, successfully, then slowed it down in small steps until it was back at the original value. Maria said numbly, "What kind of sense does that make? We can run it as fast as we like, within our capacity to give it computing resources, but if we try to slow it down, we hit a brick wall. That's just perverse." Zemansky said, Think of it from the autovoice point of view. Slowing down the autovoice is speeding up Elysium. It's as if there's a limit to how fast it can run us, a limit to the computing resources it can spare for us." Maria blanched. "What are you suggesting? That Elysium is now a computer program being run somewhere in the autoverse?" "No, but there's a symmetry to it, a principle of relativity. Elysium was envisioned as a fixed frame of reference, a touchstone of reality, against which the autovoice could be declared a mere simulation. The truth has turned out to be more subtle. There are no fixed points, no immovable objects, no absolute laws." Zemansky betrayed no fear, smiling beatifically as she spoke, as if the ideas enchanted her. Maria no longer Mar- Maria longed to know whether she was merely concealing her emotions or whether she had actually chosen a state of tranquillity in the face of her world's dethronement. Durham said flatly, "Symmetries were made to be broken, and we still have the edge. We still know far more about Elysium and the autoverse than the Lambertians do. There's no reason why our version of the truth can't make as much sense to them as it does us. All we have to do is give them the proper context for their ideas." Repetto had created a puppet team of Lambertians he called Mouthpiece, a swarm of tiny robots resembling Lambertians, capable of functioning in the autoverse, although ultimately controlled by signals from the outside. He'd also created human-shaped telepresence robots. He'd also created human-shaped telepresence robots for the four of them. With Mouthpiece as a translator, they could reveal themselves to the Lambertians and begin the difficult process of establishing contact. What remained to be seen was whether or not the autoverse would let them in. Zemansky displayed the chosen entry point, a deserted stretch of grassland on one of Planet Lambert's equatorial islands. Repetto had been observing a team of scientists in a nearby community. The range of ideas they were exploring was wider than that of most other teams, and he believed there was a chance that they'd be receptive to Elysian theories. Durham said, "Time to dip a toe in the water." "Time to dip a toe in the water." "Time to dip a toe in the water." Let's try that again. Durham said, "Time to dip a toe in the water." On a second window, he duplicated the grassland scene, then zoomed in at a dizzying rate on a point in midair, until a haze of tumbling molecules disappeared, and then individual autoverse cells. The vacuum between molecules was shown as transparent, but faint lines delineated the lattice. He said, "One red atom. One tiny miracle. Is that too much to ask for?" Maria watched the commands stream across the TVC map, instructions to a single processor to rewrite the data which represented this microscopic portion of the autoverse. Nothing happened. The vacuum remained vacuum. Durham swore softly. Maria turned to the window. The city was still standing. Elysium was not decaying like a discredited dream. But she felt herself break out in a sweat, felt her body drag her to the edge of panic. She had never really swallowed Durham's claim that there was a danger in sharing their knowledge with the other Elysians, but now she wanted to flee the room herself, hide her face from the evidence, lest she add to the weight of disbelief. Durham tried again, but the autoverse was holding fast to its laws. Red atoms could not spontaneously appear from nowhere. It would have violated the cellular automaton rules. And if those rules had once been nothing but a few lines of a computer program, a program which could always be halted and rewritten, interrupted and countermanded, subjugated by higher laws, that was no longer true. Zemansky was right. There was no rigid hierarchy of reality and simulation anymore. The chain of cause and effect was a loop now, or a knot of unknown topology. Durham said evenly, "All right, Plan B." He turned to Maria. "Do you remember when we discussed closing off the autoverse, making it finite but borderless, the surface of a four-dimensional donut?" "Yes, but it was too small." She was puzzled by the change of subject, but she welcomed the distraction. Talking about the old days calmed her down slightly. "Sunlight would have circumnavigated the universe and poured back into the system in a matter of hours. Planet Lambert would have ended up far too hot for far too long. I tried all kinds of tricks to change the thermal equilibrium, but nothing plausible really worked. So I left in the border. Sunlight and the solar wind disappear across it, right out of the model. And all that comes in is—" She stopped abruptly. She knew what he was going to say next. Durham finished for her. "All that comes in is cold thermal radiation, and a small flux of atoms, like a random inflow of interstellar gas. A reasonable boundary condition, better than having the system magically embedded in a perfect vacuum. But there's no strict logic to it, no autoverse level model of exactly what's supposed to be out there. There could be anything at all." He summoned up a view of the edge of the autoverse. The atoms drifting in were so sparse that he had to send Maxwell's demon looking for one. The software which faked the presence of a plausible interstellar medium created atoms in a thin layer of cells, next to the border. This layer was not subject to the autoverse rules, or the atoms could not have been created, but its contents affected the neighboring autoverse cells in the usual way, allowing the tiny hurricanes which the atoms were to drift across the border. Durham sent a simple command to the atom creation subprocess, an instruction designed to merge with the flow of random requests it was already receiving. Inject a red atom at a certain point, with a certain velocity. It worked. The atom was conjured up in the boundary layer, and then moved into the autoverse proper, precisely on cue. Durham sent a sequence of 1,000 similar commands. 1,000 more atoms followed, all moving with identical vectors. The random inflow was no longer random. Elysium was affecting the autoverse. They'd broken through. Repetto cheered. Zemansky smiled enigmatically. Maria felt sicker than ever. She'd been hoping that the autoverse would prove to be unbreachable, and then, by symmetry, Elysium might have been equally immune to interference. The two worlds, mutually contradictory or not, might have continued on their separate ways. She said, "How does this help us? Even if you can make this program inject the puppets into deep space, how would you get them safely down to Planet Lambert? And how could you control their behavior once they were there? We still can't reach in and manipulate them. That would violate the autoverse rules." Durham had thought it all through. 1. We put them in a spaceship and drop that in. 2. We make them radio-controlled and beam a signal at them from the edge of the model. If we can persuade the gas inflow software to send in a spaceship, we can persuade the cold thermal radiation software to send in a maser beam. You're going to sit here and try to design a spaceship which can function in the autoverse? I don't have to. That's already been done. One of the old plans for contact involved masquerading as aliens from another part of the autoverse to limit the culture shock for the Lambertians. We would have told them that there were billions of other stars hidden from view by dust clouds shrouding their system. The whole idea was immoral, of course, and it was scrapped thousands of years ago, long before there were sentient Lambertians, but the technical work was completed and filed away. It's all still there in the central library. It should take us about an hour to assemble the components into a working expedition. It sounded bizarre, but Maria could see no flaw in the plan, in principle. She said, "So we're crossing space to meet the aliens after all?" "It looks that way." Repetto echoed the phrase. "Crossing space to meet the aliens. You must have had some strange ideas in the old days. Sometimes I wish I'd been there." Maria gave in and learned how to use a mind's eye control panel to switch between her Elysian body and her autoverse telepresence robot. She stretched the robot's arms and looked around the glistening flight deck of the Ambassador. Ambassador is the title of the vessel's name. "It has been christened." She was lying in an acceleration couch alongside the other three members of the crew. According to the flight plan, the robot was almost weightless now, but she'd chosen to filter out the effects of abnormal gravity, high or low. The robot knew how to move itself, in response to her wishes, under any conditions. Inflicting herself with space sickness for the sake of realism would be absurd. She was not in the autoverse, after all. She had not become this robot. Her entire model of a human body was still being run back in Elysium. The robot was connected to that model in a manner not much different from the nerve induction link between a flesh and blood visitor to a VR environment and his or her software puppet. She flicked a mental switch and returned to the cloned apartment. Durham, Repetto, and Zemansky sat in their armchairs, staring blankly ahead. Little more than place markers, really. She went back to the Ambassador, but opened a small window in the corner of her visual field, showing the apartment through her Elysian eyes. If she was merely running a puppet in the autoverse, she wanted to be clear about where her true body was supposed to be located. Knowing that there was an unobserved and insensate shop window dummy occupying a chair on her behalf was not quite enough. From the acceleration couch, she watched a solid display screen high on the far wall of the flight deck, which showed their anticipated trajectory, swooping down on a shallow helical path toward Planet Lambert. They'd injected the ship through the border at the nearest possible point, 150,000 kilometers above the orbital plane, with a convenient pre-existing velocity. It would take very little fuel to reach their destination and descend. She said, "Does anyone know if they ever bothered to rehearse a real landing in this thing?" Her vocal tract, wherever it was, felt perfectly normal as she spoke, but the timbre of her voice sounded odd through the robot's ears. The tricks being played on her model of a brain to edit out the growing radial time lag between her intentions and the robot's actions didn't bear thinking about. Durham said, "Everything was rehearsed. They recreated the whole prebiotic planetary system for the test flights. The only difference between then and now is that they could materialize the ship straight into the vacuum, wherever they liked, and control the puppet crew directly." Violating autoverse laws all over the place. It was unnerving to hear it spelled out. The lifeless autoverse, in all its subatomic detail, had been a mere simulation. The presence of the Lambertians had made all the difference. A second display screen showed the planet itself, an image from a camera outside the hull. The view was no different from that which the spy software had shown her 1,000 times. Although the camera and the robot's eyes were subject to pure autoverse physics, once the image was piped into her non-autoverse brain, the usual false color conventions were employed. Maria watched the blue and white disk growing nearer, with a tightening in her chest. Free falling with the illusion of weight, descending and staying still. She said, "Why show ourselves to the Lambertians immediately? Why not send Mouthpiece ahead to prepare the ground, to make sure that they are ready to face us? There are no animals down there larger than a wasp, and none at all with internal skeletons walking on their hind legs. Humanoid robots 180 centimeters tall will look like something out of their nightmares." Repetto replied, "Novel stimuli aren't disabling for the Lambertians, but they're not going to go into shock. But we'll certainly grab their attention." Durham added, "We've come to reveal ourselves as the creators of their universe. There's not much point being shy about it." They hit the upper layers of the atmosphere over the night side. Land and ocean alike were in almost perfect darkness. No moonlight, no starlight, no artificial illumination. The ship began to vibrate. Instrument panels on the flight deck hummed, and the face of one display screen audibly cracked. Then radio contact was disrupted by the cone of ionized gas around the hull, and they had no choice but to return to the apartment to sit out the worst of it. Oh, one sec. Sorry about that. Where were we? Then radio contact was disrupted by the cone of ionized gas around the hull, and they had no choice but to return to the apartment to sit out the worst of it. Maria stared at the golden towers of the city, weighing the power of their majestic, self-declared invulnerability against the unassailable logic of the buffeting she'd just witnessed. They returned for the last seconds of the descent, after the parachutes had already been deployed. The impact itself seemed relatively smooth, or maybe that was just her gravity filter coddling her. They left their acceleration couches and waited for the hull to cool. Cameras showed the grass around them blackened, but true to predictions, the fire had died out almost at once. Repetto unpacked Mouthpiece from a storage locker, opening the canister full of robot insects and tipping them into the air. Maria flinched as the swarm flew around aimlessly for several seconds before assembling into a tight formation in one corner of the deck. Durham opened the airlock doors, outer first, then inner. The robots didn't need pneuma of any kind, but the ambassador's designers must have toyed with the possibility of mapping human biochemistry into the autoverse, actually creating aliens who could meet the Lambertians as equals, instead of playing with elaborate masks. They stepped out onto the scorched ground. It was early morning. Maria blinked at the sunlight, the clear white sky. The warmth on her robot skin came through loud and clear. The blue-green meadow stretched ahead as far as she could see. She walked away from the ship, a squat ceramic truncated cone with its white heat shield smoke-darkened in untidy streaks, and the highlands to the south came into view behind it. Lush vegetation crowded the slopes, but the peaks were bare, rust-red. A chorus of faint chirps and hums filled the air. She glanced at Mouthpiece, but it was hovering, almost silently, near Repetto. These sounds were coming from every direction. She recognized some of the calls. She'd listened to a few of the non-sentient species in a quick tour of the evolutionary history leading up to Lambertian communication, and there was nothing particularly exotic about any of them. She might have been hearing cicadas, bees, wasps, mosquitoes. When a faint breeze blew from the east, though, carrying something which the robot's olfactory apparatus mapped to the scent of salt water, Maria was suddenly so overwhelmed by the modest cluster of sensations that she thought her legs might give way beneath her. But it didn't happen. She made no deliberate attempt to swoon, so the robot just stood like a statue. Durham approached her. "You've never been on Lambert before, have you?" She frowned. "How could I?" "Passively. Most autoverse scholars have done it." Maria remembered Zemansky's offer of a VR representation when she first met the contact group. Durham bent down and picked a handful of grass, then scattered the blades. "But we could never do that before." "Hallelujah! The gods have landed. What are you going to do if the Lambertians ask for a miracle? Pluck a few leaves as a demonstration of your omnipotence?" He shrugged. "We can always show them the ship." "They're not stupid. The ship proves nothing. Why should they believe that we're running the autoverse when we can't even break its laws?" "Cosmology. The primordial cloud. The convenient amounts of each element." She couldn't help looking skeptical. He said, "Whose side are you on? You designed the primordial cloud. You sketched the original topography. You made the ancestor of the whole Lambert. Excuse me. You made the ancestor of the whole Lambertian biosphere. All I want to do is tell them that. It's the truth, and they have to face it." Maria looked about, at a loss for words. It seemed clearer than ever that this world was not her creation. It existed on its own terms. She said, "Isn't that like saying that your flesh and blood original was nothing but a lunatic with some strange delusions? And that any other, better explanation he invented for his life had to be wrong?" Durham was silent for a while. Then he said, "Elysium is at stake. What do you want us to do? Map ourselves into autoverse biochemistry and come here to live? I've seen worse places. The sun's going to freeze in another billion years. I promised these people immortality." Repetto called out to them, "Are you ready? I've spotted the team. They're not far off, about 3 kilometers west." Maria was baffled for a moment until she recalled that he still had access to all of the resources of the spy software. They were, still, outside the autoverse looking in. Durham yelled back, 10 seconds! He turned to Maria. "Do you want to be a part of this or not? It has to be done the way I've planned it, and you can either go along with that or go back." She was about to reply angrily that he had no right to start making ultimatums when she noticed the tiny window with its view of the apartment hovering in the corner of her eye. Elysium was at stake. Hundreds of thousands of people. The Lambertians would survive the shock of learning their true cosmology. Elysium might or might not survive the invention of an alternative. She said, "You're right. It has to be done. So let's go spread the word." The team was hovering in a loose formation over the meadow. Maria had had visions of being attacked, but the Lambertians didn't seem to notice their presence at all. They stopped about 20 meters from the swarm, while Mouthpiece went forward. Repetto said, "This is the dance to signify that we have a message to convey." Mouthpiece came to a halt in a tight vertical plane, and the individual robots began to weave around each other in interlocking figure eights. The Lambertians responded immediately, aligning themselves into a similar plane. Maria glanced at Repetto. He was beaming like a 10-year-old whose homemade shortwave radio had just started to emit promising crackling noises. She whispered, "It looks like they're ignoring us completely. But do they think they're talking to real Lambertians? Or have they noticed the differences?" Who's she whispering to, though? I'm going to assume it's Repetto. "I can't tell, but as a group they're reacting normally so far." Zemansky said, "If a robot greeted you in your own language, wouldn't you reply?" Repetto nodded.
And the instinct goes far deeper with the Lambertians. I don't think they'd discriminate. If they've noticed the differences, they'll want to understand them eventually, but the first priority will still be to receive the message and to judge it.
Mouthpiece began to drift into a more complex formation. Maria could make little sense of it, but she could see the Lambertians tentatively begin to mimic the change. This was it. Durham and Repetto's cosmological package deal. An explanation for the primordial cloud, and for the deep rules underlying autoverse chemistry, a cellular automaton created with the cloud in place 5 billion years ago. The 2 billion years of planetary formation which strictly hadn't happened seemed like a forgivable white lie for the moment. Messy details like that could be mentioned later, if the basic idea was accepted.
Durham said, "Bad messages usually can't be conveyed very far. Maybe the fact that Mouthpiece clearly isn't a team from a nearby community will add credence to the theory."
Nobody replied. Zemansky smiled sunnily. Maria watched the dancing swarms, hypnotized. The Lambertians seemed to be imitating Mouthpiece almost perfectly now, but that only proved that they'd read the message. It didn't yet mean that they believed it. Maria turned away and saw black dots against the sky. Persistence of vision was back in Elysium, in her model of a brain. Persistence of vision was back in Elysium, in her model of a brain. She remembered her dissatisfaction, clutching autoverse molecules with her real-world